I'm very happy and honored to welcome you. I'm Joseph Bahou, the director of the Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. And I'm very humbled to moderate tonight this webinar on what we can now call the Trump's presidency and its effects on the Middle East. When we started preparing for this webinar, we were a little bit afraid that maybe on that date, some 3-4 days after elections, results were possibly not so clear, and so we kept it a little bit hanging in the headline. Tonight, I think we can very simply and straightforwardly say we're going to talk about the Trump's presidency and what it means for our region. For this, I'm very, very happy to be with good friends and mainly excellent colleagues to discuss this. We have with us Dr. Randa Slim, who's both at the Middle East Institute, where she's leading the Track 2 initiative, and also a associate professor, I think, at SAIS.
No, non-resident fellow.
Non-resident fellow at SAIS, at the School of for Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins in Washington. We also have with us Stephen Cook, who's a prolific author on the Middle East. Steve is the fellow at the Council for Foreign Relations, you know, the very well-known and very well-known established think tank in Washington and New York, a sort of powerhouse of thinking about world affairs. And Steve has recently published a book that is very timely. We'll get back to it during the discussion about the US ambitions or the end of ambitions in the Middle East. We'll ask him about that. And I'm also very happy to be with a good friend. Yes, exactly. A good friend, Tariq Masoud, Dr. Tariq Masoud, who's at the Harvard Kennedy School, a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the director of the Middle East Initiative at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School as well. We'll have something like 1 hour and 10 minutes to discuss, and I would like to start with one question to you all. Very quickly, if you can. I mean, not very quickly, take 5 minutes just to take the pulse a little bit. Given the quite outstanding, let's say, nature of this election and its result, how far are you surprised by it? And do you really think, or do you think it's a real game changer in terms of foreign policy and policy towards the Middle East? Let's start with you, Randa.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Joe, for your invitation. It's really a pleasure to share the podium with Steve and with Tariq and with you, Joe. Look, I was definitely surprised by how big the win was in terms of his ability to win all 7 battleground states. So in a way, he's coming in this time, unlike 2016, Mr. Trump is coming in with a broad mandate. He cracked through the number which he has never been able to crack until now, more than 50%, you know, his ceiling has always been around in the 40s. His floor has been in the 30s, but he has never been able to reach the 50% mark, and he did this time. So in that respect, he's coming with a broad mandate. He's going to be feeling empowered to do exactly what he wanted to do. So I'm surprised by that, by that kind of result. Now, does that mean that he's going to be any different from what he was in the past? No, he's going to be the same transactional, instinctive kind of leader. But unlike 2016, I think the personnel around him is going to be different, or the makeup of the personnel. In 2016, we had 3 different groups of personnel around him. You had the conservative Republicans, you had the ideologues, and then you had the MAGA people. And I think this time we might see 1 or 2 of the conservative Republicans, or not the same, but some of them, you know, some conservative Republicans. And I think you are going to see mostly the MAGA group around him.
This is already, yeah, thank you, Steve. This is already a very interesting observation. I want to come back to it maybe in the second half of our discussion. I mean, the tendencies or the wings around Trump. And already what you are saying is interesting. So more MAGA, less conservative. We will see what it means in terms of policy towards the Middle East. Steve, the same question is to you now.
Yeah, I was, I guess, somewhat surprised by Trump's victory. In fact, in my messages to you in arranging this seminar, I said maybe we should wait a few days because we won't really know. So I guess that give it up for me. But I probably shouldn't, just in terms of anecdotes. I live in a deep blue state, yet there seem to be a lot less lawn signs proclaiming support for Harris and Wallace. I grew up in a suburb of New York. That in my recent visits, I've noticed many more Trump lawn signs than I would have expected when I was growing up when it was a solid blue district. And the fact that Trump increased his vote totals across almost every demographic except white college-educated women is, I think, an extraordinary statement on either how well he ran his campaign, or how poorly the Democrats and Vice President Harris ran her campaign. Either way, as Randa said, he has a broad mandate and he is likely to be empowered. And what I think this means for the Middle East is that, I don't really see a tremendous change from his previous positions just because he has a broad mandate at home. We've already heard from Brian Hook, who played a critical role in his administration as the Iran coordinator, who is now leading the State Department transition, who said very quickly the administration will reapply maximum pressure. The Republican complaint against the Biden administration has been that they've allowed the Iranians to sell too much oil on the oil markets. Of course, the Biden administration did that because they wanted to keep gas prices low for American drivers, but that's going to come to an end and maximum pressure is back. The president has relayed to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he'd like to see the war in Gaza come to an end by Inauguration Day. I don't think that that's consistent with Israel's timeline. I don't think Israel really has a timeline given the political pressures in Israel. But I do think there'll be a change in terms of you will not hear the White House, you will not hear principals expressing concern over humanitarian aid in the Gaza Strip. I suspect holds on weaponry that the Biden administration, and very few weapons. This is not a large numbers of weapons. The Biden administration has overseen an unprecedented air and sea lift to resupply the IDF over the last 14 months. But in important ways, just to demonstrate to Trump's base, the evangelicals who support a maximalist Israeli policy, and the 10% more American Jews who voted for Donald Trump, that he is solidly behind Israel and he will give them as much space to wind up operations as they see fit. The ceaseless quest for a ceasefire, I think, is going to come to an end, and the administration will support a military solution to Hamas, however one defines that, which I'm not sure how you do, but that's necessarily going to be the policy. And then I think we were kidding around before we came on, and I said, it's sword dance time again, and it's actually true. I think the president-elect has a unique relationship with the Saudis and the Emiratis, and Trump will seek to, despite enormous obstacles and complications, will continue to pursue normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, given that the Abraham Accords are his signature achievement in the Middle East, even though they're less an achievement of his than the doings of other actors in the region.
Thank you, Steve. I think you went a little bit too far. I mean, we were gonna,
I'm
of course,
sorry.
enter the granular details of what you already
Well,
laid
we can
out. On
get
the
deeper into
contrary,
those issues, Joe. My
it's a good
apologies.
outline. It's a good outline. But I wanted to tell you to keep your powder a little bit dry for further on. But it's okay. It's a good start. Tariq, what's your impression, and how do you see things unfolding in terms of broader foreign policy now on?
Thank you so much, Professor Bahout. It's a really pleasure to be part of this podium with three scholars that I respect enormously. It's particularly special for me to be with the American University in Beirut at this time. The suffering of the Lebanese people is something that is on all of our minds. And so for me to even be able to offer what I consider a small, insignificant token of solidarity with Lebanon and Lebanese institutions is a great honor to me. Joe, I was not terribly surprised that President Trump won, and there are three reasons for that. First of all, the enthusiasm among men for him and his campaign was quite palpable. Friends of mine who are committed, dyed-in-the-wool Democrats, nonetheless, I think could not muster up enthusiasm for Kamala Harris and would secretly confide to kind of grudging admiration for President Trump, particularly after the assassination attempt and his response, his conduct after it. But also, I think because some people had come to see the Democratic Party as being insufficiently attentive to the particular concerns of men, particularly young men who feel a little bit under attack in the current hegemonic political culture of the United States. Another reason why I wasn't terribly surprised is that there's a lot of popular anger, particularly in cities, at what they see as, rightly or wrongly, I can't get into the granular data. I don't have command of it, but as a rising crime, increasing disorder, obviously illegal immigration. And again, I'm not really qualified to read the tea leaves in American politics, but it's not insignificant that a big driver of Trump's victory was actually decline in Democratic turnout. If you compare what Kamala did compared to what Vice President Harris did compared to what Joe Biden did, they lost a lot of voters, and it was particularly highest in blue states. And one could hypothesize that is precisely because the issues of crime and illegal immigration are most acute there. We can't also rule out that President Biden's handling of the war in Gaza was an issue, particularly in Michigan, which has a large Arab American, indeed Lebanese American and Muslim American community. I haven't seen any analyses that really accord it critical weight, but that's a hypothesis. And then finally, I feel like the Democratic Party didn't learn about what brought Trump to power in 2016. And for me, in 2016, one of the searing moments, or one of the most significant moments in the campaign in the lead up to 2016 was in the Republican primary. Trump is up there with the full panoply of Republican contestants for the nomination. And a question is posed to the panelists, to the candidates. Would you go into Iraq if we could do it all over again? And Jeb Bush and every single person on the panel says, absolutely. And Trump, I'm misquoting him, I'm sure, says something like, that's utterly stupid. It was a mistake to go into Iraq. I would never have done that, etc. And in the aftermath of that, Trump was attacked by people who pulled up old videos of him during the war in Iraq, supporting it, which utterly missed the point. The point was that by 2015, this was a guy who correctly read the pulse of a great mass of American people who saw the war in Iraq as a great blunder, a great betrayal of Americans, and never wanted to repeat that. He got that. What did the Democrats do in 2024 when running against Donald Trump? They cloaked themselves in the endorsement of Dick Cheney. So I thought that was a stunning misreading of the mood in American politics. I'll close by saying, like Dr. Saleem, I was also surprised by how large the margin was and how sweeping the Republican victory looks like it's going to be. They won not just the White House and the Senate, and it looks like they might get the House. And that brings me to the last part of your question, which is, could it be a game changer in foreign policy? And my view is it really depends on the issue. And it also depends on if he ends up winning the House. So, for example, we'll get into this in more detail. on the U.S.-Saudi security pact, if he wins the House, he'll have a lot of levers that Biden didn't have. So that would be a game changer, but not because he has different goals on that issue from Biden, but because he has different tools. On other issues, I'm far less certain. I think Dr. Salim put it beautifully. Trump is instinctual and transactional, which means he's not ideologically driven. And that could be good in some conflicts where really what you need is a real estate agent who is neutral between the two parties and just wants to get to a deal. On other things that we care about, it might not be so good. So there's concern, obviously, what he would do in Ukraine. I mean, we think that he should be supporting Ukraine's struggle against Russian aggression. One area, and then I'm going to close, that I think there will be an almost ideological shift from the prior administration is on the issue of the American commitment to the promotion of democracy and human rights. And I think very much in a Trump administration, we will see a decisive turning away from that, not just in practice, but even in rhetoric. And that may be one of the reasons that his victory is being greeted so warmly throughout the region.
Thanks a lot, Tariq. I think you covered a lot. As you said, I mean, it's an issue-based thing, so we'll get into the issues one by one in a moment. Second, I think that you said at the end is very interesting, and I relate that to what Randa said. I mean, the three wings, if really the ideologues are going to be beaten by a much more cynical approach, I think this is something interesting for the region, meaning this entire democracy promotion thing, et cetera, is gonna be really at the second stage or backstage again. We'll come to that in a moment. Before we turn to the issues and take the files one by one and get into the granulars, just let's turn the page of the past and what's finished now. Very quickly, a sort of assessment of the Biden presidency, this 4 years moment, and what would you retain in your mind are as the 2-3 marking moments or things or issues pertaining to the Middle East? What can we keep in mind? What can we keep with us from the Biden presidency? Randa.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the awful legacy of the Gaza war and the unconditional support that President Biden has provided Benjamin Netanyahu. And he has not shied away from that, despite claims here and there for suspension of some weapons, attempts that got aborted very quickly after pressure from Congress and after pressure from Jewish American community in the United States, and lack of pressure from the Arab region, particularly the Gulf states, as well as countries that have signed treaties with Israel. That's going to be the first legacy. The 40,000 plus dead children and women and destruction. And now we are seeing happening in Lebanon. That's his legacy. That's what he's going to be remembered by. For Lebanon, you know, there is a positive legacy, which is the maritime border agreement between Israel and Lebanon, which in my opinion set a model for a issue-based transactional deal, which might be the only deal going forward that's possible in the region. Gone is the era of the grand deal. You know, you are not going to have in the White House going forward, especially with Donald Trump, somebody who's interested in a mega Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement or any of that. I mean, as Tariq has said, and as Stephen has said, I think what you're going to see maybe a push for him to complete the circle by pushing for a Saudi-Israeli, you know, kind of agreement. And he might get even, the Saudis might get more exactly from the kind of agreement he can do, Because again, as Tariq said, if he has the House and the Senate, he might be able to get through, you know, some more consequential treaties, if we can put it this way, than just an executive agreement, which can be rescinded by future administration. So and then the third legacy, I mean, I hate to disagree with my friend Tariq, but the administration, yes, came in with the idea of centering foreign policy in human rights, right? And in fact, if anything, it turned out to be, it's nothing but words, in fact, and also tearing asunder the international-based rules system, and because of what's happening in Gaza. So human rights, or centering foreign policy in human rights, respecting, keeping the international rules-based order, and not keeping it, in fact, is another legacy. And the fourth legacy, which some can argue has paved the way for Russia's action in Ukraine, is this awful withdrawal, not the principle of withdrawing from Afghanistan, which personally I was for, but the awful way in which it was implemented, and the picture and the image it has revealed, to the world. And in fact, there are some analysts who would argue that the way that was conducted, in addition to withdrawal from Afghanistan, basically, paved the way by giving Putin the impression this is an administration, this is a president that I can go against without suffering many consequences.
Yes, I tend to agree with your last point. I think we tend to forget now how disastrous was the image of, this kind of visual of the optics of the way the withdrawal from Afghanistan was done. Now it's shun away. It's completely overcome by the Gaza disaster, but I think we tend to forget how important this was. Steve, what would you credit the Biden administration for or against? What are the positive and negative legacies?
Thanks, Joe. And let me, before I answer your question, Tariq mentioned the quote from Donald Trump from the Republican debate in Greenville, South Carolina in February 2016. Let me give you the exact quote since it's on page 97 of my book. Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake, blah, 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 blah. Obviously, it was a mistake. We should never have been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East. They lied. They meaning the Bush administration and everybody else on the stage, which was profound for so many Americans. The theme of the Trump campaign then, and the continuing theme of the Trump campaign now, is the elites have made you suckers and have harmed you while they've become fat cats in Washington. And that is, I think, the secret sauce of Trump, despite his conduct, that attracts people to him. I think that Randa and Tariq have raised some very interesting questions. And by the way, I was remiss in saying thank you so much for having me. What a pleasure it is to be with Randa. What a pleasure it is to be with Tariq. Tariq and I were almost on every television program during the Egyptian uprising, and I feel like we're getting the band back together here. And Joe, thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be associated with your center and AUB.
Thank you, Steve.
There really are three moments for me that define President Biden's Middle East. One was in the summer of 2021, the fist bump with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. That was really the nail in the coffin, for lack of a better metaphor, to something that Randa picked up on, of the values-forward foreign policy that President Biden announced when he traveled to the State Department 3 weeks after his inauguration and said, America is back. We're going to put our values and make them part of our administration. Of course, that went out the window in May of 2021 when he had to call Abdel Fattah Sisi a number of times to manage the conflict between Israel and Hamas during that brief conflict, and subsequently gave the Egyptian president a pass. But the fist bump with Mohammed bin Salman, who he had declared beyond the pale and persona non grata at the White House, was, I think, a defining moment and a defining contradiction in American foreign policy writ large. I don't think any other president would have been able to manage kind of bridging those two issues, the strategic imperative of the free flow of energy resources and the desire to center American values in U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. The second defining moment for me was President Biden's visit to Israel in October 2023. Had I been sitting next to the president, I would have said to him, Mr. President, if you feel that it's necessary for you to go, then you should go. You are the president of the United States. But I would have said to him, at the same time, you realize there's going to be a disconnect between what you think you're accomplishing there and what the Israelis and how the Israelis will interpret your presence there. They will interpret your presence as a green light to pursue their military operations as they see fit, regardless of what your wishes are, because they define this conflict in existential terms. They may be on grounds to define this conflict in existential terms, but you will have no influence over the Israelis, and it is going to harm the U.S. strategic position and even you politically. I said that at the moment. I'm not looking at this retrospectively. There weren't enough people around who understood Israel. And I'm not claiming to be a big Israel expert, but having spent some time there, it was clear what was going to happen. And then the third moment really has nothing to do with the Middle East. It has to do with his one presidential debate with Donald Trump, in which he looked so enfeebled and so weak that it signaled to actors throughout the region that there's really no one home in the White House, that they could pursue their interests as they see fit. There are no guardrails. The United States did not have a president who was able to or even inclined to stand up to them because he was so obviously enfeebled. And we saw immediately thereafter Israelis increase the tempo of their operations once again. The Iranians increasing their efforts throughout the region. And everybody has suffered for it, in particular Palestinians and Lebanese, but I think that was a defining moment as well, although it really had nothing whatsoever to do with the Middle East. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. The last point is a fascinating example of how sometimes very domestic, small issues can have a very strong reverberation on international politics. This is a case study for students. Thank you. Tariq, the legacy, and then we'll turn to the issues.
Thank you, Joe, and I think Steve and Randa made some very important points that I'm just going to amplify as opposed to add to. I think Dr. Salim's point that the major legacy of President Biden in the Middle East is the almost incalculable destruction in Gaza just deserves to be underlined and bulleted. I think that will be really the what all of us remember when we think about the Biden administration and its policy in the region. I'd also say sort of an addendum to that is that I think one of Biden's legacies will actually be, and this is consistent with what I think Dr. Cook said, is the weakening of the American relationship with Israel because of his underwriting of Benjamin Netanyahu. I have been just particularly struck by how opinion has really turned regarding Israel, particularly among young progressives, but really across the board. And I think a lot of that is because of the underwriting of Benjamin Netanyahu's quite disastrous policy in Gaza and now elsewhere in the region. I think this is not an original statement of mine, but I think Joe Biden is certainly the last Democratic U.S. president who will call himself a Zionist, and it's possible he's the last U.S. president who would call himself a Zionist. That doesn't mean that the U.S. relationship with Israel is going to be, broken or vastly different than what it looked like in the past, but it will be different and it will be weaker. When Dr. Salim disagrees with me, as she did on the point about democracy promotion, I change my mind instantly. And so what I had meant to say is not that the Biden administration had been pushing democracy and human rights and now Trump will not. I merely meant to say that Trump won't even do the rhetorical things that Biden was doing. But Dr. Salim is 100% correct on her point. And then I will end with a slightly cynical line, and I hope people don't take me too seriously on this. I think one of the big legacies of the Biden administration is the cementing of Jared Kushner as the United States' Middle East strategist. And why do I say that? Because if you look at what the Trump administration's signal policy effort in the Middle East, which was trying to expand the Abraham Accord, trying to get this normalization deal between Israel and Saudi, that's just an expansion of the Abraham Accords. Brett McGurk is just a poor man's Jared Kushner. And you say what you will about Kushner, et cetera, but it's very clear to me that the Biden administration had almost no strategic imagination when it came to the Middle East.
I think we already infringed very much into the issues. Let me take them a little bit one by one if we can, because there are a lot of overlapping aspects between these issues. Let's focus a little bit on the war now, the ongoing war. It's been more than a year. Probably it's going to last for a few months, at least until January 20. It's a hypothesis. Tell me if I'm wrong or right. But let's put it this way. Let's assume that what we've read in the Washington Post and elsewhere is true, that Trump in his last phone call before the congratulation call with Bibi Netanyahu told him, look, go ahead and finish what you have to do, whatever you have to do, and to finish off before January 20, and then let's start on a new footing. First of all, on Gaza and Lebanon, what would that mean? What can be done more than what has already been done? Will the transition period be amenable to that? I mean, how will it work out? This is the short term. And then the longer term, and you have already opened these issues. I think that Randa said, and you, Tariq, the transactional character of Trump bars a little bit the possibility of having a sort of grand peace process the way we used to know it with, George Bush father and etc. So what would replace that besides or aside of these sort of small transactional deals? What's the horizon for the unplugging of the Netanyahu war machine? And on that note, a small question: will Trump be able to twist the arm of Bibi Netanyahu at any point, now or later, in order to stop the war machine? Who wants to start first?
I'll go. And yeah, okay. Yeah, it's on. Listen, I mean, I'm going to give here like an advertisement to Steve's organization. The CFR, or Foreign Affairs, put a collection of articles recently after the win around what could be a Trump's foreign policy. And I recommend anybody who's interested in this to go back to that collection and read them. And one of them, in my opinion, struck me as being, super insightful and definitely based on, given the author's familiarity with Trump thinking, Robert O'Brien's piece, and who was the national security advisor during the Trump administration. And I really highlight it for your readers to take a look at it, because in my opinion, it says a lot about what the Trump foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, is going to be going forward. And so on the point of Trump not wanting war, I mean, despite the fact that during his term, there was the Afghanistan war taking place. And when you push his supporters, they will say to you, oh, but we did not start a new war during our term. We did not expand the wars that were ongoing. And so this is, in my opinion, is something that Mr. Trump, President Trump, feels very strongly about, what he calls the peace through strength. Go back to his 2017 address to the UN General Assembly when he talked about peace through strength. And so I think I tend to believe the reports about telling Netanyahu, you better wrap it up, by January 20. And whether Netanyahu will listen to him or not, I don't know. But I believe that is the case, because that's who he wants, what he wants. That's one, I think. And if we look again at the O'Brien peace, I think what he emphasizes is less of a guiding role for the United States in piercing any kind of agreement to end those wars, rather for Israel working with Egypt, working with Gulf allies to work together on an end state, on an agreement, on agreements, maybe different agreements. So I don't see the US, and I think Steve, has said, or Tariq, I apologize for forgetting. I don't see the next Secretary of State getting on a plane, engaging in shuttle diplomacy, on like Blinken has been doing, in fact, but also to no effect. I don't see a lot of their time in the White House focused on the wars. And in fact, it's going to be more and more on domestic issues. It's going to be on the southern border. It's going to be on immigration. It's going to be on China. And so the Middle East is going to be way down in terms of priority, except for the Abraham Accords and expanding it to include Saudi. And so I think in terms of ending the war, short term to medium term, you are going to see a White House that is very much supportive of Israel doing what it wants to do, again, imposing maybe a deadline on them, like get it done, no matter how you do it. And then pushing the countries in the region to work with Israel on that. But at the same time, if we talk about Lebanon, I see less of an incentive to end that war, especially if the argument is going to be offered by Israel that this is part and parcel of pressuring Iran, of containing Iran. So if that's the argument that's going to be offered by Netanyahu, and my hunch, that's going to be the argument, there will be no pressure, because that's going to be the priority. If there is any priority issues for the Trump administration going forward in the Middle East, it's Iran. It's containing Iran. It's not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, in O'Brien's piece, he talks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a symptom of the real issue. And the real issue is Iran. And it's not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so if Israel will be able to argue, and it can, and it will, that continuing the war in Lebanon is, helps containing Iran, helps put pressure on Iran, I don't think there will be any pressure put on it by the Trump administration to end it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. I haven't noticed this Brian Hook sentence. It's very interesting. It's a complete reverse. In fact, we used to say that the Iran problem is a branching out of the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean, that Iran has grafted itself on that. Now it's completely the reverse, which is a very interesting concept.
Joe, that was not a Brian Cook. It was an O'Brien. It was O'Brien
okay,
piece
okay,
in the foreign affairs article.
In foreign affairs,
wrote.
okay,
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Coming to you, Steve, you said before the timelines could be different. I mean, I'm not sure. You said I'm not sure that Bibi's timeline will be the same as Trump's one, which brings us to the question of the clash of personalities. This is one aspect. How much will Trump be able to twist the arm or to force Netanyahu to change a course or to do something? But then there's the second question that has been left hanging or pending by us so far, the longer term. I mean, can we now say that we have to bury once and for all any attempt of relaunching a peace process conducting to a two-state solution, blah, blah, blah? I mean, the entire Washington business about the peace process. Is it over forever, or is there a chance to resurrect that?
Well, let's go back to Brian Hook, who's been invoked a number of times here. He was quoted in the Israeli press just yesterday as saying that their priority will be Iran. Just as you and Randa were just discussing, Republican Party foreign policy intellectuals and activists, as well as a fair number of Democrats, regard the conflict as one as an Iran problem, not a problem of Palestine. So that is where they're going to address their attention. He has also said The president will remain interested in the quote unquote deal of the century, which is what President Trump termed the two-state solution. But he followed it up by saying, though we recognize that no one is much interested in discussing a two-state solution these days. I think when he says no one is much interested in discussing a two-state solution, he's referring to Israelis. He was talking to the Israeli press. But I think that that's an accurate statement about the administration and the people around him. Keep in mind that, one, the people around him were opposed to peace processing, sought normalization of relations and outside-in strategy, thinking that normalization of relations between Israel and Arab countries would put pressure on the Palestinians to accept basically whatever the Trump administration and the Israelis were offering. And what they did offer in their deal of the century looked pretty much like the status quo right now. Israeli overall control of the West Bank, with an archipelago of Palestinian population centers that were quasi, semi-sovereign at best. And I think that vision, there's no indication there's been a change in that vision. Overall, Trump may talk about this because he has a need to say that he can strike these deals. He fashions himself as a master negotiator. The Art of the Deal was his big famous book. But it doesn't strike me that there's going to be a lot of energy within this administration to go after a two-state solution. In fact, Trump's warning to Netanyahu to wrap things up by Inauguration Day is a signal that he does not want to have to deal with the war in Gaza during his administration. Now, as far as a broader day after kind of thing in Gaza, I have counseled when I've had the opportunity to talk to officials from the Biden administration, and my advice to the Trump administration would be the same, is that their diplomatic efforts on a two-state solution or revitalizing the Palestinian Authority may be noble, may be laudatory, but are misplaced. Because the real challenge right now is to prevent this Israeli government from resettling the Gaza Strip. And that is clearly in the cards. And it's something that I think that this administration has been, see no evil, hear no evil on. In which they've said, no, that's not going to happen. When any Middle East analyst worth their salt, as we say, understands the dynamics exactly how this could happen. And with American inattention on the issue, it's more likely to happen. So no, I don't think that there's a grand plan. I don't think that there's going to be peace processing. I think the peace process industry is dead. What that means for the Palestinians, I think, is permanent statelessness. I think some very ugly version of the status quo, marked by periodic spasms of violence. It is a dark, dark future, but I don't think we're 5 minutes to midnight. I don't even think we're 5 minutes past midnight. I think it's 1:45.
Oh, great. Can add to that, the now, especially with the coalition surrounding Netanyahu, probably the temptation to go forward on the West Bank also, and to try to stir something there in order to fulfill this dream of expansion of Israel. So I think that more is to come. I think.
Let me add one data point for you. Today, the news came that Netanyahu will be sending someone named Yechiel Leiter to be the new ambassador in the United States, replacing Michael Herzog, who comes from essentially Israeli Labor Party royalty. Yechiel Leiter was the spokesperson and leader of what's called the Yesha Council, the leader of the settlers. So I think this is a reflection of the thinking in Jerusalem about what is possible during a Trump administration.
Yeah, okay. It gives you the flavor. Yeah. So Tariq, let me go from there. I mean, if let's assume, okay, the peace process as we know it is dead. There's no two-state solution anymore. There will be some small arrangements for a sort of micro-Palestinian autonomy here and there, etc. What does it mean for the Arab order, if we can still talk about something like that? And according to you and your assessment, would the Arab big states go with that? I mean, is it easy to swallow by the Egyptians, the Saudi, I mean, I'm not naive. I know that partly the answer is yes, but how easy will it go?
Thank you, Joe. So I'm not sure. So on this, I think I will cautiously dissent from my colleagues with the stipulation that they're probably right and I'm probably wrong. But, is peace processing over? Is shuttle diplomacy dead? Is the two-state solution dead? I'm not entirely sure that's true. Jared Kushner, you may not have liked the way that he conducted his Middle East policy. But this was a guy who was shuttling from place to place. This was a guy who was trying to get a deal done, a deal admittedly that would be favorable to Benjamin Netanyahu, but nonetheless, he was trying to get a deal. And the way he looked at it was the Palestinians are weak, the Israelis are strong. We can get a deal where they get a state minus, they'll accept it because they have no alternative. Now, the calculus for somebody like Kushner, I don't know if he'll go back into the Trump administration, but for anybody in the Trump administration, is a little bit different. And I'd actually say, oddly, the Palestinian hand is a little bit strengthened. Why is the Palestinian hand strengthened? By the way, this is going to cause every one of you to laugh me out of the room. The Palestinian hand is a little bit strengthened because the Arab street, a phrase that I don't like, but Arab public opinion is strongly sympathetic with the people of Gaza and the broader Palestinian public. And that is shaping the decision calculus of the leaders of the region. First and foremost among them, Mohammed bin Salman. If you read Bob Woodward's new book, Anthony Blinken is pushing Mohammed bin Salman. And why are the Saudis saying that there has to be a Palestinian state before normalization? And the Crown Prince says, look, do I want it? Do I care? No. He says, do I care? No. Touches his heart. He's like, no, not really. But do I need it? Absolutely. Why does he need it? Because the Saudi people, the Israelis, my Israeli friends, love to delude themselves into thinking that Arabs don't care about Palestine. They say, oh, the Arabs hate Palestinians. Even if that's true, they care about the Palestinian issue. They care about Palestinian suffering. There is an entire generation of Saudis who used to, I'm talking very young Zoomer Saudis, who would say like, oh, Palestine is my father's issue. It's not my issue, who now say, it's my issue. So for somebody like Mohammed bin Salman, for whom, he does have his finger on the pulse of his population, and he does try to maintain the active support of his young population, this is an important issue. And there's a transmission belt from Mohammed bin Salman straight to President Trump, and that is called Jared Kushner. And so I don't think that it's out of the realm of possibility that the Americans would make a major investment in trying to get towards a solution. I see that Steve has his hand up, and he's going to say that I'm totally wrong. And we could go. I will stop talking about Palestine for a second, hoping that we'll come back to it because I have more to say. I do want to address this issue of Iran, and Dr. Salim is absolutely right.
We were coming to that in the second round, but go ahead, please, Tariq.
Well, I'll just say something very, very brief, and then maybe you'll give me an opportunity to say something more. What's been striking to me is how there is almost a consensus in the U.S. Establishment about the centrality of the Iranian threat. Because after all, remember, it's not just Robert C. O'Brien who says that Iran is the big threat, or Brian Hook, who absolutely believes that. But Kamala Harris, when Kamala Harris was asked, what is the number one threat to the United States, without missing a beat, she said Iran. Several of us thought, what, Russia? What about Russia? China? No, Iran. And then the Democrats had to kind of play this game where they said, no, well, so what she was talking about is just Iran is the place that is actively involved in the killing of American servicemen. But of course, there's a bigger threat. I'm not sure. I think she really did think that Iran was the major threat. And I don't think there was a tremendous amount of daylight between the Trump administration and an incoming Kamala Harris administration on on how to view Iran. I have a lot more to say about both of these issues. I'm going to stop in the interest of allowing the moderator to moderate.
By the way, Tarek, I completely agree with you. And I think that instinctively, or more than instinctively, Benjamin Netanyahu knew that, understood that. And what he's doing is exactly, I mean, riding the wave of something, an obsession about Iran in the Western world. So I think that he's very, I mean, shrewd to do that. Steve, you had the two fingers.
Yeah. I want to just the peace process, but something Tarek said I want to underline before I disagree with him. The Harris, towards the end of this campaign, was far more hawkish on Iran than Trump has ever been. Despite Trump's bellicose rhetoric during his administration, he was not an Iran hawk other than maximum pressure, which was not designed for regime change. It was designed to bring the Iranians back to the negotiating table so he could get a quote unquote better deal. There were other people in his administration who had other Iran agendas, but he wanted a deal so he can say he got a better deal than Obama. Now, let me disagree with Tarek for a second. One, he's focused a lot of his analysis on Jared Kushner. I read Jared and reviewed Jared Kushner's book for Foreign Policy Magazine, and he was a peace processor. Despite his self-image as a disruptor, he was a peace processor, and he was committed to this idea, despite the fact that he brought to the Palestinians an unworkable plan that was, deeply humiliating to them. But it's very unclear whether Kushner is actually going to play a role here. If personnel is policy, he's focusing on his beach resort in Albania right now, rather than being a person around the president and the transition. In addition to the fact that much has changed since Kushner disappeared in January 2021. So it strikes me that the people who you can immediately identify around the president talking about these issues, none of them are committed to the idea of a peace process. I do agree with Tarek that the Palestinian hand is somewhat strengthened, but not necessarily because of Arab public opinion. And we've known that about Arab public opinion. We've known that about Mohammed bin Salman for a time. I think it's strengthened by the fact that the president of the United States, the president-elect of the United States, is probably the world's leading narcissist. And he doesn't have a great relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. And the moment that Netanyahu snubs him, he will roll out the red carpet for Mahmoud Abbas and allow Mahmoud Abbas a lot of room in Washington with his administration. So I think that there is perhaps the opening for the Palestinians. But again, of course, what we tend to ignore in all of this is the problem of Israeli politics. And that is the hard right, the settlers, who are not just found in settlement, but the religious Zionist movement throughout Israel is both a part of the government, and the Israeli state is both culpable for the situation there, and they're also opponents of the government. And they are demanding certain things of Netanyahu that make his timeline incompatible with Trump's and may make normalization incompatible with Israeli policy, despite the fact that they say they're interested in it. Thanks.
Randa, let me now turn to you. Let's get into the Iran issue a little bit more in details. I mean, let's say that now we have, again, the short term and the longer term, the two windows. And that, okay, now we all agree, and it's obvious that Iran is now the issue number one for everyone, from Netanyahu to most American circles, and also in the West, I mean, in Europe and etc. What are the options? Option one is to take benefit of this window that is still open, hit Iran strongly, put it on its knees and bring it to a new negotiation, to a JCPOA plus, muscular, etc. Option two, hit the nuclear in Iran and solve the problem by canceling it. I mean, completely obliterating the nuclear option for Iran. And option three, which I don't exclude personally, but it takes us to something else then, to the ideological, let's say, dimension in the Trump administration, regime change. I mean, really attempting at hitting the regime's security, prestige, etc., and then opening up the way for a revolt inside Iran that would stir a little bit, I mean, some chances for a change, a toppling of the regime there. This is the agenda. Where could we head towards with the Trump administration from now till 20 January and especially after that?
Well, I mean, there is still the potential of an Iranian retaliation to the retaliation, right? I mean, which can happen anytime or which might not happen, given the change in Washington, that it might be delayed. So that is a wild card right now that will determine a lot of the thinking inside the Trump administration coming into office on January 20. I really think he is not, I mean, Trump himself is not a regime change person. It doesn't mean that people around him will not be regime change people. But I think, as I said earlier in my remark, the ideologue of the three categories of people who were around him in 2016, who were for regime,
referring to. I mean,
yeah,
these three circles.
who were for regime change, like the Bolton of the world, right? These people are out. They are not. I think what you are going to have is, mostly the MAGA people who, and he said it in his campaign. He would like to make a beautiful deal with Iran. He said, he kept repeating, I have no problem, I want to make a beautiful deal with Iran. I mean, Trump is not into, he is a businessman who will deal with whoever. For him, everything is a business negotiation, is a business deal. It doesn't matter who is across the room from you as long as you get what you want from him, right? Or from her. And so he will see pressure tactics. I mean, people around him will definitely sell him the idea of containing Iran, enforcing sanctions on Iran, which had not been enforced strongly, enforcing sanctions against entities that are buying Iranian oil and gas, which, by the way, put some of the organizations, some of the people, some of the regimes who are supposedly allies in the region in the crosshair of the administration. So I think what he wants is a deal, and that's maybe could be part of his legacy. I mean, as who said it? I think recently but Trump wants to leave this term with a Nobel Peace Prize, and there are not that many different ways to get a Nobel Peace Prize, right? Mm. Either you are going to do an Israeli-Palestinian deal, grand deal, a two-state, or you are going to do some kind of an Iran deal, and do that. And that could be, in his thinking, the two pathways to go through, with Iran being more favored by his people around him who are not interested in a two-state deal. So my concern is that Obama was able to do a deal with Iran because, of course, of geopolitical conditions, because of who was on the other side. But also Obama had the intellectual capacities, the attention span to be able to lead that process from the White House. I'm not sure Trump has that. And I'm not sure Trump has people around him who can do that, to be very honest. And right now, he might, I don't know, he might bring back Pompeo and task with that. But Pompeo is instinctively against a deal with Iran. But he might do what he did in Afghanistan. After all, remember, everybody at the time in his administration was opposed to a deal with the Taliban. And what did Trump do? He go and picked Khalilzada, right? And said to him, get a deal for me. And he did that. So I think he can find maybe somebody now who can negotiate with the Iranian and get him a deal. But a deal with Iran will require really a major presidential lift, not only in terms of political permission, but also intellectually. And I'm not sure Trump has that kind, again, I'm repeating myself, of attention span, but also intellectual capacities to push this through.
Steve, what's your view on that?
I certainly agree with Randa. The John Boltons there's no place for the regime change folks in the administration. However, there are people like Brian Hook, there are people like Mike Pompeo, there are people like Tom Cotton who may very well end up in positions in the administration. Let me put my cards out on the table. As a longtime employee of the Council on Foreign Relations, I guess I am the walking, talking embodiment of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. And I start from the premise that the Iranians are bad guys and that the Iranians' goals are to push the United States out of the Middle East, the destruction of Israel, and to sow chaos and advance its agenda to become the regional hegemon. My view is, though, that, and my view also is that Iran is a nuclear capable state at this point, rendering regime change ever more dangerous and stupid, to be quite honest about it, and that my preferred approach is containment and deterrence for the Iranians. It seems to me that's something that is possible, feasible. We have the resources to do it. And it neither precludes dialogue with the Iranians nor at times the use of force should it be necessary. I think all of this discussion, I think the president would like a deal. I do think, though, that anything resembling the JCPOA is likely to fail. I don't think you're going to get the votes in the Senate for it. And that's something that the administration, that the Iranians, in an entirely rational way, will demand because they don't want another president walking away from a better agreement. And so I don't think an agreement is in the cards. And I think the JCPOA was this kind of ultra complicated type of agreement that was unsustainable over a period of time because of our politics, because of US politics, not because of anything having to do with Iran. So I think in the world in which we live, the best thing is deterrence and containment. But I agree 100%. Trump is looking for an agreement. He wants to stun the elite who have long shunned him as a carnival barker to prove to them that he can do something that others can't. That's either Israelis and Palestinians, Iranians, or Ukraine.
So, I mean, the takeaway from that, and I turn to you, Tariq, is that Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli is too costly, too difficult, too arduous. Iran deal in the way that it has been described is within reach, but is there enough political capital in the coming administration to do that? I mean, would they spend time, energy, and bandwidth on this issue, or just turn away? And it's a transition to my last and next question on the US presence in the region.
Thanks for the question, Joe. I'm not sure that I understood my colleagues' comments in exactly the same way you did, and again, that's probably because I misunderstood them. But is an Iran deal more likely than a Palestine-Israel deal? I'm not sure. I don't know that I would conclude that. And I think everything else that they said, I agree with. I think President Trump absolutely doesn't want war with Iran. I think, as Stephen mentioned, the John Boltons are out. There may be others who have similar cast of mind, but Trump has made very clear what he thinks. Now, that said, I will just relay that I have, had many conversations with Israelis and individuals from the Gulf who are far more intelligent and far more plugged in than I am. And they say to me that we now have an opportunity to make to the Iranians an offer that they cannot refuse. We can go to them and say, cut it out with the proxies, cut it out with the nuclear program, or else we're doing regime change. And the credibility of this threat emerges from what Netanyahu was able to do. This theory holds that the Israelis have shown that the Iranians are completely naked. Okay. Israel can strike it. This is not Tariq Massoud speaking. This is Tariq Massoud relaying what he hears from people, that the Israelis have shown they can strike Iran wherever they want. Iran wants to play a proxy game and weaken countries domestically. Israel can now do that to Iran. What if Israel bombs Khuzestan, okay, and or bases in Khuzestan and constantly creates a governance crisis in that territory that others would fill? You can see how the thinking is, and so there's an expectation or a hope here on the part of some connected and intelligent people that Trump can actually now come in and force the Iranians to do a deal or else. And like Stephen and Rhonda, I am deeply skeptical of that because I think, as they pointed out, Trump doesn't like war. He's happy to establish escalation dominance, as he did with by killing Qasem Soleimani, but he doesn't want to get into a shock and awe a la Iraq 2004. So for me, the puzzle is, why do people who are very smart and connected think this is a possibility? Why do they think it's possible that that the Trump administration could pursue this line on Iran? Is it because they think that there will be enough personnel, and Steve is absolutely right, personnel is policy, in the Trump administration that think this way? Is it because, again, it's not just the Israelis who want this, it's a lot of folks in the Gulf, and that, that constitutes a kind of winning coalition? I don't know. Okay, but I definitely think that's a view that's out there, and it's a voice that's going to be not whispering, but indeed screaming very loudly in President Trump's ear.
Okay, we see. No, I think we now got to the same point. I mean, the idea is that exactly because Iran is perceived as being naked and almost on its knees, you can come to it and say, this is the deal, better take it and save the regime. And this could be for Trump his cosmetic victory and his Nobel Prize ticket for the future.
Yeah, but just to sort of small two finger on my own point, but if the way that it's presented by that I just presented it doesn't feel like the kind of deal that gets you a Nobel Peace Prize. Number one, but because it requires a very credible a threat of American force that, in fact, I just don't think Trump could credibly make. Okay. So if Trump were to make a kind of deal with the Iranians that would get him a Nobel Peace Prize, it wouldn't be that kind of deal, and consequently wouldn't be a deal that would make any of his core friends happy. And on the flip side, I do think there's a possibility for a deal on the Palestinians. The Saudis want it. I think the Israelis could be brought to understand that it's necessary. And so that's why I was making the case that I wouldn't give up on the Palestinian deal.
I got you.
Can
Randa, yes.
Yeah. Look, whenever we are discussing Iran, it's not a bilateral issue. It's not Iran, the US. It's Iran, US, Israel. And you have
and the rest.
And Saudi.
And the rest.
Yeah.
And Saudis.
Emiratis,
yeah, but in terms of US domestic politics, I think, and I mean, Israel is an important factor. So I will put Israel, US on one side and, Iran on the others. And so I don't see Netanyahu, and I don't see a change in Israeli government anytime soon. I don't see Netanyahu buying into being happy. In fact, if he's going to do anything, is create as many obstacles inside the US that prevents such a deal from happening. And on the other hand, also in Iran, you have a succession crisis, a country that is going to be in the midst of a succession crisis. And any deal of the sort that Tariq's talked about, or you have been talking about, you are weak, you are down, you are not out, but you are down, this is the deal. I'm sorry, it's going to be very hard for an ailing supreme leader or for, to say, yes, I'm going to accept it in fact, they're going to rejected. And so we have to look at the analysis and the situation of the Iranians, where they are, with the Americans, the Israelis, the Gulf. Yeah, the Gulf can have a lot of influence and pressure and all of this, and can prevent. In fact, the Gulf is the incentivizers for Iran. If there is anybody that can, offer the incentives that Iran wants, it's not only the sanctions, because lifting the sanction, the US sanction can go far, but it's also the economic opportunities that the Gulf can offer, which is a very big incentive for Iran. I think this is how we need to analyze the situation. And in my opinion, it makes me more pessimistic than optimistic about the possibility of it.
True. Steve, you had also something to
Joe,
say.
I know you want to get to your last question, so
No, please go ahead.
I just wanted to comment just quickly, and I know that Randa, given how much time she spent in Washington, and Tariq as a keen observer of what happens in Washington, that this idea that plugged in individuals and this theory about going to the Iranians, deal or no deal, I think folks in Washington can in conference rooms convince themselves of absolutely anything about anything in the Middle East, and we've seen that over and over again. Which is one of the reasons why I wrote my book, The End of Ambition, is that we come with up with these crazy ideas, but they often have no connection to reality. Especially when the Israelis are leading these or framing the debate. They are in the region, but they don't understand the region as well as they think they do. And I don't know how many times I've heard Israelis give me this grand plan, and I look at them and I say, have you asked the Palestinians? You know, they just don't, they're not connected in ways, and Washington tends to give it a little too much credibility on these issues.
Okay, you mentioned your book, and this is exactly what leads me to my last question. It has been the looming question in DC and in the US and in US policy circle. Is the US retrenching from the Middle East? Is the Middle East less important? How much is it still important? How to manage to approach the new century? And what's the place of the Middle East in it? You devoted a book to that, Steve, The End of Ambition. I'm giving you just a heads up because I'm using it for my course next semester. So thank you so much. But I would like very quickly to conclude on that. What's your view on this probably open-ended question? And I don't think that Washington has an answer now, especially after 1 year of war in Gaza. Cards have been reshuffled. Where do we stand on this question in 2 minutes each? Please, Randa, go ahead.
Yeah, I have started with the answer. Let me end with answering. Like, give it to my colleagues. Let them go ahead first.
Okay, so we start with the author of the book.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you assigning it. That means a lot to me, and I would love to hear, how the students react to it. That's a part of one of the audiences for which I wrote the book. But I wanted to call the last chapter of the book "Searching for Goldilocks in the Middle East." One of my mentors thought that was not a good title for a chapter, but what I really meant was, not too much United States and not too little United States. I don't know where we came up with this idea that the Middle East isn't important, won't be important, it should be de-emphasized. We are looking at the globe, and the Middle East is critically important for a number of reasons. Just the way in which we've approached it over the course of the last 25 years, where we tried to remake societies that we really didn't understand, was quite frankly insane. It was a Washington fever dream. But the idea that we can just kind of pull out and the Middle East isn't important to us any longer and we don't need oil because we're all going to drive around in Teslas is as silly as the idea that we can remake societies. We have interests and goals and things that are important to the United States in the region. There is a new era that is emerging in the global order, and the Middle East is going to play a role, not as necessarily as something that the United States or the Chinese or the Russians can shape, but clearly leaders in the region want to shape the region themselves. And that's very, very important. And the United States should be deeply engaged, but in a way in which we understand the limits of our power, what's possible, how to be constructive, and how to devote resources to that without going off on these crazy ideas about remaking the region. That's my plea to American policymakers.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. I think, Tariq, if you can answer the same question by including maybe the factors of contending powers in the region, China, Russia, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, Joe, you asked me that too late. I've already formulated my answer to the question, but I'll try. Look, I think I agree with Stephen, this idea that the Middle East is going to become less important. The Middle East, as Stephen says, is a part of the world. The U.S. has to pay attention to the entire world, and it will continue to. And anybody who says that the United States, that the Middle East is diminishing importance in the United States just has not been paying attention to the last year. I mean, I teach on a campus that has been absolutely riven over the conflict in Gaza, and that's the case on college campuses across the country. As I started my remarks, there's a plausible hypothesis that President Trump was able to win the state of Michigan because of the dissatisfaction of a small segment of the, but politically critical segment of the Michigan population with President Biden's policy towards the Middle East. So I think that the United States remains deeply engaged in the Middle East, and that what's happening in our region will will always command American attention. And then finally, just to try to bring in the consideration that you asked me to include, Joe, we talk about pivoting to Asia, okay? I mean, which again is a little bit frustrating because it assumes, or it starts from the premise that the greatest superpower in the history of mankind is like a professor with ADHD who can only focus on one thing at a time. And you think to yourself, like, well, to paraphrase Madeleine Albright, what's the point of having this vast bureaucracy if we can't use it? But we have to stay engaged in the Middle East because, and we can't just do a quote unquote pivot to Asia because Asia's pivoting to the Middle East. Okay. China is deeply engaged in the region, right? Chinese support for the Iranians indeed might be part of the formula here for why the Iranians had been so emboldened of late. And so I think that all of those factors suggest that we will always be deeply engaged in that region, and President Trump will be no different from his predecessors in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Randa, the last word is to you. Unmute.
Look, I think we will remain engaged. The question is how. I think there will be a right sizing of the engagement, and that has been taking place for a while now. Sure. Like in terms of the engagement, what are the drivers of the engagement are changing. There is a war, we get engaged to try to end the war. China is getting involved in the Middle East. We try to engage to limit Chinese involvement. But I think our engagement is going to be partly driven by how the region is changing. The region itself, the dynamics in it are changing. And so the Middle East of the past required certain level, certain type of US engagement. The Middle East of today needs a different kind of US engagement. And that's the question is, can we be in sync with each other, meaning the US and the Middle East, in what kind of engagement serves US national interests, but also what kind of engagement is acceptable, is needed in the Middle East to further those national interests.
At the end, we have a slight positive note. It means that the region has an agency, and this is something that we often forget. Randa Slim, Stephen Cook, Tariq Masoud, I really can't thank you enough for, I think, what has been a tremendously interesting webinar. I'm really very grateful for your time and to you. I'm grateful to the audience also. We had a good audience. This webinar will very soon be put on our outlets at IFI. Please stay with us whenever we do something like that. And I hope that we will have the occasion to do something else with you, colleagues. Thank you very much. And I wish you a good rest of the day and see you soon. Take care.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe for your role. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.